My wife asked me if she could kiss her boss at the company party, and I just smiled, the taste of iron in my mouth, and said, sure. And tomorrow I'll stop by HR to let them know it's over. I turned and walked away, leaving behind her nervous laughter and a toast that never was. Sometimes life doesn't scream, it whispers, scratches inside, and in that moment, as the words left my mouth like a cold blade, I knew it was over. The love, the respect, the history, everything. It was like watching a war movie inside your own chest, where the bomb has already fallen, but the debris is still flying in slow motion. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't beg. I just said, sure, like giving someone else permission to dig their own grave. And as I walked out of that party, amid toasts and fake smiles, I realized she would never understand what she had lost, until it was too late. That night, something inside me died. Not love, not yet, it's more resilient than it seems. But hope died. That silent faith that, even with flaws and setbacks, we were on each other's team. That we held a story in our hands worth fighting for until the end. Because I fought. I fought against fatigue, against silence, against the routine that slowly hurts. I fought to be present, to be a partner, to not let time corrode us like rust hidden beneath the veneer of a stable relationship. But she chose to test it. And when someone has to test the love they receive every day, it's because, deep down, they no longer deserve it. We were together for years. We shared plans, trips, bills, secrets, fears, birthdays, and holidays. I knew every detail of her body, but also her silence. I knew when something wasn't right, even if she said, everything's fine, with that mechanical smile. And yet, I chose to stay. I chose to try. Until the night of the party. Until she looked me in the eye with that uncomfortable gleam, not of guilt, but of excitement, of someone faced with a new, forbidden, provocative possibility, and asked, in her usual sweet voice, would you mind if I kissed him? She didn't say, my boss. She said, him. And I heard the world crack. I felt ashamed. Not of her, but of myself, for having loved someone so much who no longer loved me back. The cruelest thing was her casual tone. As if she were asking me for permission to try a different dish at dinner. As if she didn't know, or didn't care, about everything I'd already swallowed for her. And I smiled. Because it was either that or smash a glass on the table. Because it was either that or fall to my knees in front of everyone, begging her to go back to being who she once was. But I smiled. I said, sure, and left. The difference between love and pride, at that moment, was a step toward the exit. I learned later that the boss backed down, perhaps out of cowardice, perhaps out of ethics, or perhaps because he realized he was entering a territory with more wreckage than pleasure. She was left alone. In the middle of the party. No toast. No kiss. Without me. Trying to erase the bitter taste of her own choice, swallowing the freedom she so desired and which, now, weighed like an anchor. We didn't speak for weeks. Then for months. Life went on. Hard, cold, disorganized at first, but over time, it took on new forms. I learned to make coffee for just one person. Sleeping in the middle of the bed. Washing only one dish at dinner. And each day I woke up and she wasn't there, I realized the pain was giving way to freedom. Not a euphoric freedom, full of parties and quick loves, but a quiet freedom. The peace of no longer needing to question whether I was enough for someone who had already broken inside. And then, one day, she came back. Not physically. But she came back through the wet eyes of a meaningless text message at 3 in the morning. She came back through the misplaced words of a cut audio, I think, maybe I didn't know what I had. But now I do. She came back through the perfume left in an old coat I'd accidentally found in a box. She came back with longing, but not mine, hers. Because while I was learning to walk alone, she was stumbling over her own regrets. Her voice was different. It held a hesitation I'd never heard before. And more than that, it held pain. Real pain. The kind that comes after pride is broken, posture is shattered, mistakes become mirrors. I know I messed up. I thought I needed to experience something new. But it wasn't him I wanted to kiss that night. It was you. I heard it all. In silence. Because there are pains that time doesn't heal, it only teaches us to live with them. And when she asked me if there was still a chance, I saw in her eyes not the woman who betrayed me, but the girl who lost what she didn't know was true love. I forgive you, I said. But it wasn't to bring us closer together. It was so she could move on in peace. Because I was already moving on, with someone who didn't need to test, someone who didn't treat love as something disposable. The betrayal wasn't the kiss not given, it was the desire to give it. It was the request that exposed the soul. It was doubt where there should have been certainty. And today, when I look back, I don't feel anger. I feel pity. Not for myself. But for her. Because I survived. I grew. I remade myself. But she still looks for something in others that she once had, and lets slip through her fingers as if it were nothing. And the strangest thing of all is that, even after so much time, even after everything I've been through, I still remember the question she asked me that night. But what truly stuck in my memory wasn't the question. It was my smile. Cold. Silent. And definitive. Because that wasn't just the end of a relationship. It was the birth of a new version of myself, a version I would never again accept being relegated to the background, not even by the person I claimed to love. But what exactly did she do after that night? What happened to her in the months that followed? Did she truly understand the gravity of the choice she made? And have I moved on as fully as I seem? Or is there still a part of me stuck in that unfinished party? The answer, perhaps, lies in the details that have not yet been told. Welcome to the channel. Here, no form of betrayal is romanticized or justified. The stories you will hear are fictions based on real feelings, created to show, without filters, how betrayal can destroy true loves, entire families, and leave deep scars. Our goal is clear: make you feel, reflect, and never forget that wrong choices have irreversible consequences. Now take a deep breath. Because what you're about to hear will mark you forever. Get ready. The story begins now. They met simply, as most great encounters begin, without fanfare, without warning, without promises. Just two strangers sharing the same space in a nearly empty cafe on a typical Thursday afternoon. Lucas was absently reading a news article on his cell phone, with a cup of coffee already cold beside him, when he felt that gaze, not intrusive, but curious, calm, as if wanting to understand, not just look. Marina was across the room, wearing a beige coat, her hair tied up casually, and a cup in her hands. She smiled rarely, but when she did, there was a certain mismatch between shyness and intensity. He noticed it before any words were exchanged. And perhaps that was it, the comfortable silence between two strangers who, somehow, seemed to recognize each other even before introducing themselves. Marina was a journalist, passionate about words, stories, and everything that involved trying to understand what goes on inside people. Lucas was a financial manager, methodical, stable, a little too skeptical, a little too serious, but with a sweetness that slipped through his defenses when least expected. She dreamed of writing a book. He dreamed of building a family. And when they began seeing each other frequently, neither realized that their dreams, so different, were beginning to intertwine, not out of necessity, but out of desire. There was no rush, and that was beautiful. Their relationship grew with the delicacy of genuine affection, the kind that doesn't impose itself, but becomes indispensable over time. They dated for 2 years before sharing the keys to a small apartment full of plans. The first few months of living together were more quiet than vibrant, but there was a peace rarely found in beginnings. Marina liked to leave notes stuck to the bathroom mirror. Lucas insisted on washing the dinner dishes even when the day was exhausting. They learned each other's rhythms, their fears, their silences. And, over time, their love took root, something solid enough to last a long time. It wasn't a cinematic love, full of epic scenes and rehearsed declarations. It was a real love. Made of nights when they fell asleep fighting but still tucked each other in during the early hours. Of Sundays when the silence didn't bother them. Of conversations about nothing that suddenly became everything. Friends said they complemented each other. She was impulsive, dreamy, full of sudden desires. He was cautious, down to earth, careful to the point of being almost predictable. And for some reason, it worked. Marina challenged him to break out of autopilot. Lucas taught her to slow down. Together, they were stronger, lighter. The wedding took place on a beautiful late afternoon, with a reddish sky in the background and few guests. Nothing fancy. Just the closest ones. Her eyes sparkled in a way Lucas never forgot, and he said it often, that day was living proof he'd been right to persist when she wanted to call it quits in the second month of their relationship, when she thought it was too intense for someone like him. But she stayed. And they stayed. At least, for a while. The routine of their marriage was like so many others, full of commitments, work, exhaustion, but also of affection, care, and a constant attempt to keep what they had built intact. Lucas was dedicated, attentive, tried to share household chores and reserved Friday nights just for the two of them, even when work demanded more. Marina, for her part, immersed herself increasingly in the professional world. After being promoted, she began working on larger projects, events, trips, and meetings until late. She was excited and fulfilled, and Lucas was proud. He always encouraged her, never complained about her absences, even when he missed her. "You're shining," he would say, as he put dinner away for her in the fridge. She would smile, thank him, kiss his forehead, and tell him this was all for them, for their future. But slowly, almost without realizing it, something began to change. Not explosively, but like a silent crack that spread, discreetly. Marina started arriving later, more distracted, more distant. There was still affection, but it seemed less present, less visceral. Lucas noticed, but didn't say it. Maybe out of fear, maybe out of blind trust. I preferred to believe it was just fatigue, just a phase, just the weight of too many responsibilities. I continued to prepare dinner. He kept leaving messages on her phone. I continued planning that trip for the end of the year. And I hoped everything would go back to the way it was before. On her side, life seemed to move faster. Meetings, deadlines, business lunches, side conversations, new friendships. She was discovering herself in a different way. She felt strong, interesting, noticed. And sometimes, though she wouldn't admit it even to herself, she felt Lucas was part of an older phase, too stable, too predictable. But there was no disrespect, no lies, no irreversible decisions, not yet. There was just a subtle distance, slowly creeping in, and a certain unease that grew silently. And when she felt guilty about it, she remembered the difficult times they'd faced together, his patience, the way he made her laugh even when she wanted to cry. She remembered that, yes, she still loved. But love, sometimes, gets lost between the lines. Lucas, for his part, began to feel he needed to do more. He was willing to adjust his own life to have more time with her. He arrived earlier, tried to take an interest in her projects, and listened attentively even though he didn't understand half the names and roles involved. But even so, there was a void. As if they were in the same room but in different time zones. When he tried to talk, she smiled and said everything was fine, that she was just tired. And he believed her. Because love, sometimes, also means deceiving yourself a little. Not out of blindness, but out of hope. Weekends became more filled with outside commitments. Meetings with coworkers, events, group coffees. Time together, once sacred, was now squeezed in between obligations. Lucas insisted on movie nights, dinners at home, morning walks. Marina, even though clearly tired, accepted. But he knew. There was something different in the way she looked at him. Less charm. Less urgency. More habit. More obligation. And he wondered if it was just an impression. If it was all in his head. Because, deep down, there was still laughter, still affection. But something was missing that he couldn't quite put his finger on. The relationship continued, with its ups and downs, like many others. It wasn't perfect. But it wasn't unhappy. At least not for him. For her, perhaps the desire for novelty had already overcome stability. Perhaps she'd wondered more than once what life would be like if she'd made different choices. Perhaps she'd begun to look around with more curiosity. But Lucas didn't know. And he continued to believe in the us as an unshakable certainty. He believed that love endured everything, as long as it was true. He believed they were just going through a phase. And then came the invitation to the company party. A formal, elegant event, with all the important names in the industry. Marina hesitated to invite him, saying it would be something more intimate, professional, without the need for a chaperone. But Lucas, feeling increasingly excluded from her world, insisted. She relented. He bought a new shirt. He wanted to impress. He wanted to show he still belonged. He wanted to be by her side. And that night, as he got ready in front of the mirror, he put on a smile as if he were wearing armor. He didn't know it yet, but that would be the night everything would change. Not scandalously, not with fights or shouting. But with a simple phrase. An unexpected request. A gesture that, alone, would be capable of changing the course of an entire story built with such care. He didn't know it yet, but soon, he would discover the limit between loving and giving up. Between waiting and leaving. Between forgiving and allowing himself to be happy again. Because sometimes, the biggest shock doesn't come from the betrayal itself, but from the exact moment you realize the other person no longer chooses you. And that love, no matter how strong, doesn't survive where it's not a priority. Marina walked slowly among the guests, her wine glass nearly untouched in her hands, her eyes scanning the luxurious room with that expression of someone seemingly too comfortable in a place that, to many, would seem impersonal. Her co-workers were there, laughter came from all sides, loose comments about goals achieved, projects in progress, awards expected. Everything pulsed as if the corporate world were an extension of each person's life. And, in a way, it was. For her, especially, that environment had become more intimate than home itself. It was there that she felt active, valued, noticed. And perhaps that was precisely why Marina barely noticed Lucas's discomfort, sitting alone near the bar, wearing the new shirt she'd bought just for that night, observing how much he seemed like a mere detail amidst a setting where she shone alone. He smiled, but his eyes were tired. Not from physical fatigue, but from trying to understand where he'd lost himself in the equation. He greeted her colleagues politely, asked genuine questions about their projects, laughed quietly at jokes he didn't fully understand. But inside, everything felt out of place. There was something unsettling him, not just feeling left out, but a perception difficult to translate, the feeling that she already belonged somewhere else, and he was just a memory she carried out of obligation. The way she spoke to one colleague in particular caught his attention. Not through obvious gestures, but through subtleties, the time they spent together talking, the way she fixed her hair when he approached, her laughter becoming looser, lighter, more frequent. Lucas tried to ignore it, tried to rationalize, to convince himself it was just silly jealousy, but intuition had a cruel way of whispering truths before the facts arrived. On the way home, the silence in the car was thick. Marina talked about the praise she'd received, how the new project was being well received, how she might be invited to represent the company at an international event. Lucas listened, responded with words of encouragement, but his mind was elsewhere. There was a detachment about her that could no longer be ignored. She seemed excited, but absent. Like someone narrating their own life to someone who's no longer inside them. When they arrived at the apartment, she went straight to the bedroom, took off her shoes, and began wiping her makeup in the mirror. Lucas stood in the living room for a few minutes, staring into space, feeling something was about to break, though he didn't yet know what. In the days that followed, the atmosphere between them fluctuated between automatic and cordial. She left early, returned late, often brought work home, and when they were together, the conversation always revolved around obligations. It was as if their lives had become a calendar of appointments. Lucas was trying to reconnect. He cooked dinners, suggested a weekend away, tried, somehow, to remind them of who they had been before everything became a burden. Marina smiled, thanked him, sometimes even accepted, but there was always an invisible wall between them. A space that, no matter how hard he tried to fill, only grew wider. It was on a Wednesday that everything began to unfold more clearly. Lucas came home early, decided to prepare a dish she liked, lit candles, and put on soft music. He wanted to surprise her, even though he wasn't sure she'd be back in time for dinner. When she walked in, the look of surprise was genuine, but it was quickly replaced by an expression of suppressed guilt. She said she'd eaten something at work, that she didn't know he was planning it. She tried to smile, tried to hide it, but he noticed the way she avoided eye contact. That night was marked by superficial conversation and long silences. When they went to sleep, Lucas lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to her breathing beside him, too calm for someone who seemed conflicted. The following week brought more abrupt changes. Marina began to get irritated over small things. Her answers were shorter, her patience thinner. Lucas tried to talk, tried to ask if something was wrong, but she deflected. She said she was stressed, that work was too demanding, that it was just a phase. He wanted to believe. But each time she left for extra meetings, each time she returned with her phone in her hand and a distant look in her eyes, his faith wavered a little more. Until one day, she surprised him with a question that cut through everything like a bolt from the blue. Sitting in the living room, after a silent dinner, she asked softly, almost casually, "Would you mind if I kissed someone else? Like, just to see what it would be like?" Lucas froze. The world seemed to spin slower. The sentence echoed in his mind in a strange, distorted way, as if it made no sense, as if it couldn't have been said. He stared at her for long seconds, trying to find some hint of irony, of a joke, of anything that would save him from reality. But there was none. There was just a fixed gaze, waiting for an answer. His mouth curved into a restrained, bitter smile, and the answer came without hesitation, "Of course. And tomorrow I'll stop by HR to let them know it's over." Marina said nothing. She remained silent, her face frozen, as if struck by something she hadn't expected. Lucas calmly got up, grabbed his keys, and left. He didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't break anything. He simply left behind the image of a woman who, at that moment, no longer seemed like the person he'd chosen to live with. She tried to laugh, a nervous laugh, perhaps an attempt to dismiss the whole thing as a misunderstanding. But it fell flat. The door had closed. Over the next few days, she called a few times, texted, saying she wanted to talk, that maybe she'd overreacted, that she was confused. Lucas didn't respond. Not because he wanted to punish her, but because there was something inside him that no longer allowed him to talk to that version of her. The pain was immense, but there was no anger. There was disappointment, and that, sometimes, is much worse. Because when you're disappointed, you realize that the love you felt was perhaps greater than the person deserved. Marina, for her part, sank into a void she couldn't explain. Her boss, with whom she'd been flirting for weeks, backed away from the tension of what had happened. He said he didn't want any trouble, that she needed to sort out her life first. She was left alone. With her own decisions. With the eyes of her colleagues who noticed Lucas's withdrawal. With the discomfort of someone who realizes, too late, that she's losing something valuable. Time passed. Things didn't go back to normal. Marina began to miss Lucas's silence, the way he listened even without understanding, the way he knew when she needed a hug without her saying it. She missed the details, the notes, the smell of the coffee he made without sugar, just because he knew she liked it bitter. And for the first time, she began to realize that what she had discarded wasn't just a relationship, it was a real, whole, patient love. She tried to get closer. She looked for places where she knew he might be. She sent longer, more sincere, blunt messages. She asked to talk, not to get back together, but to be heard. And he accepted. They met at a small cafe, the same one where it had all begun years before. She arrived first, anxious, fiddling with her bag strap. When he entered, Marina felt something tighten in her chest. He was different. Lighter. More serene. But there was no hurt in his eyes. Just a distance that hurt. She apologized, using all the words she could muster. She said she didn't know what she had in her hands, that she'd confused excitement with necessity, that she'd exchanged the essential for the fleeting. He listened. Without interrupting. Without judging. And when she finished, the silence between them was as thick as it had been at the beginning of the story. But now, it was a different kind of silence. Lucas responded with a serene, sad, but firm smile. He said he forgave her. That he understood. That he, too, had made a mistake in expecting too much from someone who was losing her way. But now, there was no longer room for what they were. Because he had found a new path. And, more than that, someone who no longer made him feel like a burden. Marina didn't cry there. But something inside her broke. And it was only later, as she left the cafe, that she felt the tears well up. Not because I expected him to agree to come back, but because, deep down, I knew it was the end. And worse than the end was knowing he'd moved on, while she was still trying to understand why she'd given up everything. But there was something Lucas didn't know yet. Something Marina hadn't had the courage to say in that conversation. Something that would change the way he viewed everything that came after. And that something was about to come to light. The silence that remained after coffee was no longer a void between two who had once loved each other. It was the closing of a cycle that, for Lucas, was already buried, but which for Marina began to hurt with the clarity of someone waking from a dream too late. She had understood, for the first time without illusion, the exact extent of what she had lost. But time doesn't allow us to go back and rehash the details, and even though he had made it clear he forgave her, the absence of any attempt at future rapprochement was more eloquent than any speech. Marina moved on, or tried to move on. She returned to her routine, immersed herself in work, avoided places they had once frequented together, and also began to avoid mirrors that reflected more than her face, they reflected the consequences. A month later, on a cloudy afternoon, she happened to see him crossing the street with a woman by his side. The scene lasted seconds, but it was enough to make everything inside her fall apart. There was something in his posture, light, relaxed, almost carefree, that unhinged her. She stood there, unable to decide whether to cross to talk or let fate keep the distance between them. She didn't pursue him. But that night, he couldn't sleep. And in the days that followed, the thought returned with greater force. The feeling was that something still needed to be said. A growing unease that wouldn't be quelled by regret or silence. And that's when he decided to write a letter. But he gave up. He decided to record an audio recording. He deleted it. Nothing seemed enough. Until, without warning, he arranged a meeting. One last conversation. A personal request. Not to get back together, not to change anything. Just to deliver something I'd been holding back for months and had decided never to tell. But now, silence seemed too cowardly. They met in a park, on a humid late afternoon with a gray sky. She was sitting on a wooden bench, her eyes fixed on the calm movement of some leaves on the ground. When he arrived, he didn't smile. He simply nodded and sat beside her, leaving a respectful space between them. She didn't know where to begin. He, as always, waited. After a few seconds of only the distant sound of children and leaves rustling, she finally spoke bluntly, "I need to tell you something I should have said before, but I didn't have the courage." Lucas didn't move. He just looked at her, his head shaking slightly. She swallowed. The words were there, all pent up, but her throat felt blocked. That night, at the party, I knew what I was doing. I wasn't just swept up in the moment, the tension in the room, the mood. I had planned it. I thought about taking you there to see me with him. To see if you'd react. If you'd feel jealous. If you'd wake up. I wanted to provoke you. And it was selfish, cruel, and childish. But that wasn't the worst part. Lucas kept his gaze fixed, now with an expression that mixed incredulity and calm. Marina continued, her voice already starting to crack. The worst part is that before the party, 2 weeks before, I had already cheated on you. It wasn't just flirting. It wasn't just intention. I met him. It happened. And I regretted it soon after, but I couldn't stop. It happened 3 times. And after the party, he pulled away, as you can imagine. But I stayed alone, and I decided never to tell you. Until now. Lucas took a deep breath. It wasn't a sigh of despair, nor of anger. It was a long breath, like someone trying to accommodate information that couldn't fit inside their chest. His face remained serene, but his eyes were now red. He was silent for a few seconds, and Marina felt like each second was a punishment. "And why now?" he asked. His voice wasn't aggressive, nor cold. It was just tired. She looked at her hands, pressing her fingers together. "Because you deserve to know. Because I can't bear this anymore. Because I realized that saying I loved you and hiding it was the worst form of cowardice I could have committed. Because, of all the people in the world, you were the last person I wanted to hurt. And that's exactly what I did." The wind picked up a bit, blowing strands of hair across her face. Lucas lowered his eyes, running his hands over his thighs as if trying to find support in anything physical that would keep him from falling apart. When he looked up, there was a new hardness in him, but it wasn't revenge. It was recognition. "You didn't just betray me with him. You betrayed me with the idea that I was disposable. With the certainty that you could use me as a mirror for your doubt. And I accepted much more than I should have. Because, even though I felt it, I wanted to believe in you." Marina tried to speak, but he continued, his voice firmer now. "And when you asked me for permission to kiss you that night, I understood everything. I understood that, to you, I was no longer the partner. I was the obstacle. The test. And yet, I just walked away. I didn't yell at you. I didn't humiliate you. Because, deep down, I still wanted to save what dignity remained between us. But now you're taking even that away from me." Tears streamed down her face, discreet, silent, like a confession her body could no longer hide. "I'm not asking for anything, I swear. Not a return, not even forgiveness. I just wanted you to know. That's all." Lucas nodded slowly, his eyes still on her, but with a distant expression. "You didn't want to lose me. You just wanted everything. But now you understand what it's like to live with less than you had. And what hurts the most, is that I still can't hate you." She took a deep breath, trying to hold back her tears, but he had already stood up. He looked at her one last time, his expression calm but definitive. And he said, with a serenity that cut deeper than any scream, "You didn't just destroy our story. You destroyed what I believed was love." Marina sat there, her chest open, exposed, hurt. And for the first time, there was no room for bargaining. Nothing could be fixed. What had been done went beyond easy forgiveness. It was an exposed fracture in the memory of a love that had once been real. She finally understood that the betrayal wasn't just physical. It was emotional. It was the deliberate choice not to protect the one who protects you. And that is the kind of mistake life exacts with interest. Lucas left the park without looking back. And as the sky began to darken more heavily, he knew that this revelation wouldn't be the end of his pain, but it was, without a doubt, the end of any shred of hope. What Marina didn't imagine, was that there was one last piece to this story. Something Lucas had lived in silence after the separation. Something she would only discover later. Something that would show, irreversibly, that he hadn't just moved on, but had found the kind of love she could never rebuild. Lucas didn't return home that day, not to the old apartment where every wall told a piece of their story, where every object carried with it the memory of a gesture, a touch, or a laugh. He headed toward the new neighborhood where he had started over, and every step he took seemed to confirm what his soul had known for a long time: there was no turning back, and, more than that, there was no more emptiness. The encounter with Marina was the necessary end of something that no longer belonged to him, but the real turning point had happened weeks earlier, in a small bookstore where he bumped into someone who would completely change the direction of his life. Anna wasn't a substitute, she wasn't a relief or a refuge to heal a wound. She was whole. And, most importantly, she was a choice. Anna had a firm and direct manner, but her eyes held the delicacy of someone who sees beyond words. They started out talking about books, but little by little, their meetings became longer and more frequent, and without Lucas realizing it, her presence began to occupy spaces he thought would never be filled again. With her, he didn't have to struggle to be seen. There were no games, no silences that hid demands. With Anna, love seemed simpler, more sincere. And so, when Marina reappeared, asking for that last conversation, he knew he needed to put an end to what remained of the past so he could live in the present with the dignity that true love demands. The days passed after their encounter in the park, and Lucas remained silent. He didn't respond to messages, didn't check in on Marina. He chose complete distance, not out of resentment, but because he now knew that if he looked back, he risked betraying himself. He had spent too much time trying to mold himself to her needs, and now, finally, he had found someone who accepted him exactly as he was. And more than accepting, Anna made him feel proud of himself. Not because she constantly praised him, but because, with her, he could be vulnerable without fear of being diminished. Marina, on the other hand, sank deeper and deeper into the consequences of her choices. Guilt, which once seemed like a distant echo, now became a constant presence. Friendships drifted away. Invitations dwindled. At work, despite maintaining her performance, she no longer had the sparkle in her eyes that made her stand out. And her boss, the one with whom she had crossed boundaries, didn't even greet her with the same naturalness. Everything around her seemed to have lost its color, and no matter how much she tried to rationalize, deep down she knew it was the direct result of disloyalty, not only to Lucas, but to her own feelings. It was then that Marina discovered something she hadn't expected. She was on her way to pick up a document at the co-working space she'd started frequenting when, upon entering the reception area, she saw Lucas holding hands with Anna. They were both laughing at something silly. Anna was playing with her hair, he was holding a bag with 2 coffees, and their eyes were searching each other in a way that made it clear the whole world could be falling apart around them. They would be fine. Marina froze. She wasn't seen. And in that moment, a truth tore through her soul like a sharp blade: he hadn't just moved on, he was loving again. But in a different way. There was no effort in what she saw. There was no tension. It was a light, natural, easy love. Exactly what she destroyed when she tested, when she doubted, when she wanted to try. That night, alone in her apartment, she listened, once again, to the audio recording she had sent him weeks earlier. His words seemed distant, almost naive. And his silence at the end of the audio, the simple fact that he had never responded, now made sense. He was already in a different emotional place. And perhaps, somehow, he had already understood everything before she had even confessed. Marina lay on the sofa with a half-empty bottle of wine, the remote in her hand, but unwilling to turn on the television. Her eyes fixed on the ceiling, as memories came flooding back. They weren't just memories. They were snapshots of a time when she had had everything, and thrown it away. Across town, Lucas was preparing dinner with Anna. They laughed about the mistakes in the recipe, the stories they'd shared that day, and when he hugged her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Anna turned her head and kissed his cheek, whispering a, "Thank you for existing," that shattered him inside. Lucas smiled, tightened his arms around her, and replied without hesitation, "I'll never stop being me, for anyone. With you, I can be whole." She didn't ask where that outburst came from, just smiled back, with the silent understanding of someone who knows the other is slowly healing from deep scars. 2 months later, Marina decided to write a letter by hand. Not with the intention of sending it. Just to purge it. She wanted to put into words what no longer fit inside her. She wrote about her mistakes, about the illusion of freedom she felt when she started cheating, about the false sense of control she gained from teasing, and about the real pain she felt when she realized she'd lost not just a husband, but the best friend she'd ever had. At the end of the letter was a simple sentence, written in shaky handwriting: "You were the love of my life, and I only realized it when I was no longer part of yours." She folded the paper, put it in an envelope, and put it in a drawer. Not to send. Just to remind herself of the cost of pride, ego, and carelessness. Meanwhile, Lucas was preparing a surprise for Anna. It was her birthday, and he planned everything with the care of someone who has learned to appreciate small gestures. A sunset picnic, with simple flowers, light wine, and a book of poems he knew she loved. During the impromptu dinner, Anna looked at him with eyes full of emotion and said she never thought she would feel so safe with someone. That with him, love was a home, not a prison. Lucas smiled, held her hands, and replied that he was experiencing what he always believed he deserved, a love that chooses to stay, not tests to see if it's worth it. The following week, Marina saw them again. This time, in a small cafe where she often went with Lucas. They were sitting side by side, laughing at something they were reading on their phones. Anna rested her head on his shoulder every now and then, and he, without realizing it, caressed her fingers. Marina didn't cry. She didn't move. She simply felt, in every part of her body, what it meant to lose someone by choice. And the most painful part, seeing that this person not only recovered, but found exactly what she believed she would always have. No scandal. No revenge. Just the weight of an irreversible absence. That night, Lucas received one last message from her. Short. No requests. No drama. Just a bitter acknowledgement: "You were greater than I ever knew I deserved." He read it. He didn't reply. He deleted it. And moved on. Not because he wanted to erase the past, but because, for the first time in a long time, the present was enough. He had what had previously seemed impossible: love, respect, and lightness. And now, finally, he understood that the betrayal hadn't been the end of his story. It was merely the bridge that led him to the chapter where, at last, he learned what it meant to be truly loved. Time began to move at a different pace, slower for some, lighter for others. Marina, enveloped in memories that would never find closure, began to live between what had happened and what she couldn't prevent. The feeling that everything could still be different consumed her in the most unexpected moments, like when she stumbled upon small, everyday gestures that previously seemed insignificant: a plate of food they used to order together, an advertisement for a trip they'd once planned, a song playing on the radio that she'd always skipped without thinking, but which now, suddenly, made her stop. It was as if the world refused to allow her to forget what she'd had. And no matter how much she tried to distract herself with routine, the void left by the absence of meaning only grew, creating a kind of pain that doesn't scream, but drags. On the other side of this story, Lucas remained steadfast, but not immune. Loving again, after being broken, is always a courageous decision. And even though he was right there with Anna, there were moments, rare but real, when memories came flooding back, not out of longing, but out of processing. Because dealing with pain requires more than overcoming it, it requires acceptance, and Lucas, in his usual stillness, understood this without needing to name it. He didn't hate Marina. Nor did he blame her as he once did. Over time, he began to understand that some people simply don't have the emotional structure to care for what's precious, and this doesn't make them monsters, but it does make them dangerous to those who love with abandon. Forgiving her wasn't difficult. What was difficult was recognizing that, for a long time, he tried to save someone who hadn't yet decided to be saved. Anna was everything Lucas didn't know he needed. Intelligent, sensitive, but also direct and self-assured. She didn't play games, didn't hide behind manipulative silences. When she was upset, she spoke. When she was happy, she showed it. And Lucas learned from her that love, when true, doesn't need constant proof. It exists, endures, and manifests itself in small but consistent gestures. Still, the weight of the past would surface from time to time, like when he happened to see an old photo saved in some digital archive, or when he involuntarily compared behaviors. At those times, he would take a deep breath, look at Anna, and remember that the present was real and deserved to be lived to the fullest. Marina was now facing the other side of what it means to have been unfaithful. After the truth came out, some friendships dissolved, not out of judgment, but out of natural distancing. People can tell when someone carries unresolved regret, and it's frightening. She began to be viewed with a certain discomfort, unspoken but noticeable in the looks, the prolonged silences, the conversations that changed subjects when she approached. And the cruelest thing of all was that, as remorseful as she was, she knew it didn't erase anything. Mistakes can't be undone with tears or promises of change. They remain. And worst of all, they shape the way others see you. Even so, Marina tried to rebuild her life. She went to therapy, immersed herself in her work more intensely, and began to connect with her family, whom she had previously kept at bay. But none of this filled the void left by what she had lost by choice. She knew she could find another relationship, that life could eventually take a new path. But she also knew, with the clarity that only comes after a fall, that the love she had with Lucas was the kind that doesn't happen twice. It was stable, but not cold. It was intense, but never suffocating. It was simple, but profound. And that, now, seemed more precious than anything that could come. There was one day in particular that marked a definitive rupture between the two worlds that were once one. Lucas was invited to speak at an event on emotional balance in modern relationships, and Marina, by chance, learned of his participation through a mutual friend. Without much thought, she decided to go, sit in the back rows, and simply listen. He spoke clearly, confidently, without any hint of resentment in his tone. He talked about the importance of not losing yourself trying to save something that hurts, about the power of forgiveness, but also about the need to move on when respect is lost. He spoke about emotional rebuilding, about finding yourself again after a traumatic breakup, about knowing how to recognize someone who loves you for who you are, not for what you offer. And then, in a passage that seemed to be spoken directly to her, even though it wasn't, he said, "Sometimes the greatest act of love is to walk away. Because staying would be complicit in your own destruction." Marina left the lecture with tears in her eyes, but she didn't cry in public. She saved her tears for when she got home, for when she lay alone on a mattress that now felt emptier than ever. The pain in that moment was no longer self-hatred, nor immediate regret. It was the realization that the world moved on, and that sometimes, wrong choices follow you like a shadow, even when the light finally arrives. Anna, upon hearing about the event, asked if Lucas was okay. He told her Marina had been there. Anna didn't react with jealousy or suspicion. She simply nodded and said it was good that things were being put in their proper place. Lucas smiled, held her hand, and said there were no more ghosts. Only memories. And that memories, when they no longer hurt, cease to be threats and become just part of the landscape of the past. In this new environment, Lucas began planning his future with Anna. They talked about living together, perhaps traveling for a few months, perhaps even writing something together. She, in her observant way, said that his story deserved to be told, but that, above all, she wanted to be part of the chapters yet to come. And he, now, felt ready. Not because he wanted to forget, but because he had transformed the pain into maturity. Into wisdom. And above all, into self-respect. On the other side, Marina wrote another letter. This time, unlike the last, it wasn't a plea for forgiveness, nor an attempt to justify. It was a record of someone who finally understood. An internal outburst, perhaps never read by anyone. She wrote about the silence that remained after the end, about how the days seemed gray not because of a lack of color, but because of an excess of awareness. She wrote that she understood what it means to lose someone not because they left, but because she herself pushed them. She said she had learned that love can't be tested. It takes care of itself, protects itself, honors itself. And at the end, she signed off simply with a "thank you." Because, even with all the pain, she knew she had grown from the loss. Too late for them, but still in time for herself. The dilemma that remained was this: is it possible to redeem a mistake that destroyed someone? Does forgiveness free the receiver or the giver? And, most importantly, can love that is shattered by betrayal be reborn somewhere else, purer, stronger, truer? Lucas found his answer in the warmth of Anna's hands, in her eyes that never doubted him, in conversations that left no loose ends. Marina found hers in solitude, in internal reconstruction, and in the certainty that some mistakes cannot be corrected, only accepted. The world spun, with its twists and turns, and their story, though over, continued to echo in its details. Because true love, when left untended, doesn't die, it transforms into absence, and this absence speaks louder than any scream. Now, the end approached, not with explosions or dramatic revelations, but with the serenity of those who understand that the end is sometimes the only way to begin again. The end didn't arrive with a bang, nor with grand twists. It settled definitively in their souls, like a fog that, after long insistence, finally dissipated to give way to that cruelest thing, clarity. There was no more doubt, no unresolved grief, no more disguised hope. Marina, in her apartment too bright for the emptiness she carried inside, stared at her reflection in the window. The streetlights flickered rhythmlessly, reflecting in the weary eyes of someone who now knew what she had lost. And while the city moved on as if nothing had happened, she remained there, motionless, as if time no longer included her. Days after the event, Marina decided to return to the bookstore where she'd learned Lucas used to frequent. Not because she expected to see him again, but because she felt something of that space still belonged to them, or at least to the image of him she held. Entering, she walked the aisles in silence, touching the books with her fingertips, as if searching for meaning in other people's words. He stopped in front of the philosophy section and read the title of a book as if it were a personal provocation, The Consequences of What We Don't Say. She smiled bitterly, and before she could delve into another layer of regret, she was interrupted by a soft voice from the other side of the bookshelf. It was Anna. She recognized her before she even saw her fully. The voice had that disconcerting calm, as if everything about her were always at peace. The encounter was brief. Anna also recognized her, and there was a moment of palpable awkwardness, a shared hesitation between two women who knew exactly who they were to each other. Neither tried to feign surprise, neither tried to escape. Marina broke the silence with a gesture that surprised even herself. She approached and, in a respectful but firm tone, said she needed to thank her. Anna frowned slightly, confused, and Marina continued. "Thank you for caring for him as he deserved. For offering him what I destroyed. I don't expect you to understand everything, but I know what I lost. And as much as it hurts, it's a relief to know he found someone who sees him completely." Anna didn't respond immediately. She watched Marina for a few seconds, then spoke, her tone gentle but filled with assurance. "It's not easy to hear this, nor to say it. But know that he no longer harbors hatred. He simply learned that love shouldn't be begged for. And I came into his life at a time when he was ready to be loved lightly." Marina nodded with a restrained smile. She didn't cry, didn't try to justify it, or prolong the encounter. She simply said goodbye with a, "Take care of him, even on the days when he tries to appear too strong." And then she left, without looking back, knowing that nothing she said or did would change anything, but maybe, just maybe, she had closed one last cycle within herself. Lucas learned of the meeting the next day. Anna told him naturally, and he listened without showing surprise. He simply asked how she was, and Anna replied that, despite her evident sadness, Marina seemed sincere. He was silent for a moment, then said he didn't want the past to interfere with what they were building, and Anna, with the same calmness as always, assured him there would be no interference. Your past is what brought you here. I only care about who you are now. That night, while they were preparing dinner, Lucas mentioned that he was thinking about changing jobs, accepting an offer he'd turned down months ago for fear of starting over too much at once. Anna encouraged him, reminding him that it's not about erasing what came before, but about respecting one's own limits and desires. This new phase, then, began to take shape more clearly. They began looking for a new apartment, not out of necessity, but out of a desire to build something together from the ground up, without echoes of old stories. They visited places, discussed styles, argued over wall colors, and laughed at the differences that arose along the way. It was all new, all alive. Meanwhile, Marina, alone, began writing more regularly. She filled entire notebooks with reflections, unsent letters, poems that mixed longing with guilt. One poem, in particular, became special. She wrote it on an afternoon when the silence of the house suffocated her more than usual. She spoke about choices and their consequences, but not in a tone of lamentation. It was a silent plea for forgiveness to herself. In the end, she wrote, not every mistake needs an answer. Some just need to be acknowledged, lived with, and accepted as part of who we have become. Months passed. Time, as always, did its work. Lucas and Anna were already living together, having a peaceful routine of simple commitments and sincere affection. Marina, for her part, had left her old workplace, changed her look, and started a new course. There were no longer any illusions about regaining what she'd lost, but there was a genuine desire to at least not repeat the same mistakes. She didn't want to be remembered only as someone who betrayed. She wanted, at some point, to be someone who learned. One day, chance, always chance, brought the three back to the same place. A small cultural event organized by a mutual friend. Lucas and Anna arrived together, greeted their acquaintances, and sat among others. Marina arrived later, already aware of their presence, but still decided to stay. During the presentation, their eyes met briefly. There was no tension. Only recognition. When the event ended, Marina approached slowly, and Anna, noticing the movement, stepped aside to greet someone else, making room. Marina extended her hand to Lucas, who shook it gently. The two looked at each other as if they had already experienced everything they needed to experience. Marina spoke first. You seem happy, Lucas replied without hesitation. Because I am. And you? She thought for a moment before answering. I'm trying to be. And in some strange way, knowing you're okay helps me with that. Lucas nodded. You're not the same person you were before. And that's a good thing. Pain changes us. Marina smiled, not a light smile, but an honest one. Sometimes, it's the only way to learn. The conversation lasted only a few minutes, but it left them both with a sense of true closure, a sense that what had once united them now set them free. When Anna returned and saw them talking, Lucas naturally hugged her waist, and Marina understood that gesture said more than any words. It was a silent, I'm where I'm supposed to be. And in that moment, there was no more bitterness. Only the past. And when Marina said goodbye and left, something inside her also left. The guilt, the painful regret, the weight of still carrying hope. The memory remained. Harsh, but transformative. Lucas and Anna left hand in hand. In the car, he commented that he felt light, as if a final door had closed. Anna smiled and said that doors should be closed, so that new windows can open without wind entering through the wrong place. And that night, as they slept, Lucas dreamed of the past, but for the first time, he woke up without any weight on his chest. Marina, alone at home, lit a candle, not for symbolism, but because she enjoyed the warm light it offered. She sat at the table and reopened the notebook where she'd been writing. Turning the page, she found an old poem, written on one of the worst days she'd ever experienced. She smiled wistfully and scribbled next to it, "Today, it didn't hurt to reread it." It was the beginning of a new phase. One in which she knew exactly what lost love cost, but also what she could build from it. There was no easy redemption, no romantic fresh start. There was realism. Truth. And that, in itself, was already a step. Now, the paths were set. And even though the stories were different, what held them together was the same lesson: love isn't meant to be tested. It's meant to be nurtured. When you fail at this, what you lose isn't just the other person, it's a part of yourself that may never return in the same form. Time marched on as it always does, relentless and serene, and the paths that seemed intertwined in some distant era remained firmly separated, as if they had never belonged together. Lucas now walked a new path in life, solid, built step by step based on truth and lightness, but above all on the awareness of someone who has suffered, learned, and never turned back. He had decided to move on, but not just physically, which, for many, is the easiest part. He moved on emotionally, mentally, and, above all, spiritually. In Anna, he had a partner, present, who didn't seek to win arguments, but to understand silences, who didn't test love, but lived it carefully, as if knowing that what is fragile can also be strong when reciprocated. Their relationship wasn't perfect, but it was transparent. There were no empty promises, no memorized speeches. There were daily choices, small kindnesses, and the building of a trust that didn't need to be regained because it was never violated. They moved into a new home together, and every corner of that house was filled with real intentions, no recycled memories, no pacing. For the first time in a long time, Lucas felt like he belonged to himself before he belonged to anyone else, and that was precisely what made it possible to belong to another completely. He began to write. Not a book, as Marina had once dreamed, but chronicles, fragments of thoughts, reflections that emerged in the late afternoons, when the silence of the house brought a peace he had never known before. He published them on a small blog, which quickly gained a loyal readership. People identified with the direct, honest, and sometimes painful way he spoke about loss, choices, and rebuilding. One of these chronicles told of the night he said, "of course," to the woman who asked for permission to cheat on him. There were no names, there was no exposure, but there was so much truth in every word that many wrote, saying they had cried, that they saw themselves there, that they understood that love is also knowing when to let go. The text went viral. And once again, Lucas's life took a turn he had never planned: lectures, invitations, conversations in discussion groups about relationships and emotional health. He became a reference for those seeking new beginnings. Not because he was a hero, but because he was honest enough to say that he had to lose everything to learn to truly love himself. Marina, on the other hand, followed her own path, and it was no less profound for being more silent. She didn't have a public redemption, she didn't write books, she didn't go viral on social media. Her process was internal, solitary, and intense. And this was perhaps the most fitting part of it all, facing herself without an audience. She dedicated herself to her studies, to her private writing, to tending to wounds that didn't heal with time, but with effort. She moved cities, started over professionally, but, more importantly, she stopped looking for excuses in others for the bad choices she made. The pain didn't turn into hatred or obsession, but rather into clarity. She spent years without getting involved in another serious relationship, not because of trauma, but because she understood that she should only allow herself to love again when she was capable of giving her best, not what was left after her falls. And even amidst this maturation, there was a shadow that never left her, the regret of losing the only man who loved her honestly. It wasn't regret that paralyzed her, but a constant reminder that love is responsibility, and that some flaws can't be erased, they can only be carried. Years later, Marina watched an interview with Lucas on a dating channel. He talked about forgiveness, the importance of leaving hurtful relationships, and how true love doesn't require diminishing yourself. Marina watched it all in silence, lying in her new living room, a hot tea in her hands and a light weight on her chest. It wasn't envy, it wasn't acute sadness, it was the mature acceptance that she had been part of an important chapter in someone's life, but that her participation ended there. For the first time, she didn't wish to go back in time. She simply wished to continue being someone who wouldn't repeat the mistakes she'd made. She saved that interview among her favorites, as if it were a memory of a movie that transformed her, even though it hurt. Time passed. Lucas and Anna were married in an intimate ceremony, without pomp, but full of meaning. Their vows were exchanged beneath an ancient tree, and when Lucas finished his, he said something that remained with everyone who heard: "You taught me that love isn't a test, it's a shelter. And I promise to never forget that." They lived a peaceful life, without great drama, but with great affection. Years later, when they had a daughter, Lucas held that child in his arms and, deep down, thanked them for every pain, every betrayal, every tear. Because all of it had brought him to that moment. Marina moved forward in a different way. The loneliness that had once been painful was now a comfortable companion. Occasionally, she wrote to herself, with no intention of publishing, but with the urgency of someone needing to keep the lesson learned alive. She met other people, allowed herself brief relationships, but never again lied about who she was. She became a better person, but at a high cost. And she accepted it. Not as punishment, but as truth. One day, while walking through a bookstore in another city, she found one of Lucas's books on the shelf. She opened it at random and landed on the exact page that said, "Not every ending has to be happy to be necessary." She smiled. Closed the book. And continued. This was a story about choices. About what happens when we treat love as something disposable. About how the smallest moment, a question, a flirtation, a nurtured doubt, can be the beginning of the end of everything. And about how, sometimes, the greatest pain we can cause another is not a lie, but the omission of loyalty. Lucas was betrayed, but rebuilt himself. Marina betrayed, but learned. Anna arrived later, but was the bridge between pain and healing. Each followed a destiny consistent with their own decisions. Because life, unlike invented stories, exacts its toll. It exacts a high price. If you got this far, comment, what would you do in Lucas's place? Do you think he should have been given a second chance? Or do you believe that some choices really have no turning back? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Here, stories like this are told to make you reflect, feel, and, most importantly, understand that love and loyalty go hand in hand. This channel does not support any type of cheating. Remember, betrayal doesn't just destroy the other person. It destroys respect, love, trust, and often the betrayer themselves. Think carefully before hurting someone who only wants to love you. Because some wounds don't bleed on the outside, but remain open forever on the inside. And not every apology comes in time. Some arrive only to remind you that the love is gone.